Hey everyone, it's Duncan from overlandjournals.com and welcome to part 5 of my series Overlanding or Off-roading for Beginners, and today we talk about safety, emergencies and communication. Welcome back everyone. Okay, a slight change to my video today because initially I was going to use this part 5 to talk about whether you as a newcomer to the lifestyle should be going remote or not. But I kind of changed that and I put a whole lot of other different parts I was going to do as separate videos altogether. So today I'll be talking about safety, communications and emergencies, what to deal in those situations or what to do in those situations. And at the very end, I'll just touch on whether going remote is a good idea or not, or whether you should do it at all or not. And I felt by putting them all together, it'll give you a lot more value. Before going any further, a big apology on my part. In part 4, which was last Thursday's video, where I talked about camping gear, there's one very vital piece of camping gear which I completely left out from the edit. I did the edit, I rendered the whole video, put it up to YouTube, and then it was a day later I realized that they didn't make it to the edit. So my apologies for that, and with all the other work I've got, I just didn't get time to redo it. So I'm going to talk about take a few minutes today to talk about that, and that is you need to have a stove in that list. A stove is essential. You need to make some food, you need to keep yourself filled up. So yeah, a stove is essential. Now briefly, there are different types of stoves you can get there. You get LPG powered stoves, you get single burner, double burner, butane powered, gas powered stoves, and I've seen a few fancy and quite effective solar powered cooking stoves as well, though I've never tried one of those. I use an LPG gas powered stove, which get different sizes of LPG gas bottles you can buy. So you gotta decide what kind of a stove works for you and how much of gas you need to carry, depending on how many you are in your family or how many you'll be traveling. I used initially had a single burner stove because I used to do a lot of traveling all by myself, and you'd think that a single burner is good enough when you're traveling all by yourself, but I found not enough. So ideally I would recommend, even if you're just planning to travel by yourself, get yourself a double burner. It's a lot easier. You can get a lot of cooking done within a short period of time. And as you get more and more into your lifestyle and you get others traveling with you, you got your two burners, so it makes life so much easier. So LPG powered stoves or butane. Now butane powered, for those of you who don't know, we get these butane canisters, and these butane canisters, there's a slot into which you put it into the stove and it powers, very simply putting it. I personally am not a big fan of these butane powered stoves, and reason is, over the years I found that after not a whole lot but a fair bit of use, the mechanism that holds the butane canister in place and then that sort of lets the gas in through to the stove tends to get worn out very quickly, even with some of the better brands, and they tend to leak out a little bit. It may not seem as a huge problem, but one day when I was using my butane stove, which I had at the time, it was a very windy day and a little gust of wind, and the part over here where the leaks generally happens caught fire. So that was quite scary. I managed to put it out in time. So ever since then, I've had a few others telling me of similar experiences they've had with their butane powered stoves. So I generally wouldn't recommend it. I could be wrong. Maybe I just had a bad experience, and maybe the few friends I spoke to, they also just been unlucky. But I'm not a big fan of it, so I'd rather stick to a LPG, which is much easier, and the bottles last a lot longer. So yeah, so stove should be in that list. Once again, my sincere apologies for leaving it out of the edit. Okay, so the first part of today's video, which is, I'll start with communications and what type of communication equipment you can carry with you. Obviously starting with the easiest, cell phone, and cell phone signals are not available in most remote areas, and as soon as you get off the blacktop, it's not so easy to get cell phone signals. But however, you will spend, especially like here in Australia, you'll spend a fair bit of time on the blacktop before you get off road. So you will have cell phone signal, up to that point at least. So yes, start off with, it's stating the obvious, carry a cell phone. But what you can do, and that's something I've done, is I've got an antenna with a cradle at the other end of the connection, which is a cell phone signal booster. And that works pretty well, whereas it kind of boosts the signal with fair bit. I've had situations where generally I would get only like a 3G connection with maybe a 2-bar signal strength, but once I put it into my cradle, it's given me 4G with about 3 bars of strength. So that's something, that's one of the ways of getting your cell phone signal boosted, and that I thought I'll mention it because you don't have to carry all these things, but I'm just going to mention, especially as you beginners, for you to be aware of the different types of communication equipment that's available. So cell phones with cell phone signal booster is something you could think about. One thing I'll share with you is I went for the Strike cell phone signal boosting system, and the cradle that they sell, it's more specific to the type of phone that you may have. And I would recommend go for a universal cradle, because whenever you change your phone, upgrade your phone, or go to a different brand, universal still works. So just keep that in mind. The next is a UHF radio, and UHF radios are great. I love UHF radios, and one, because if you're in convoy, you can speak to each other on the radios, have everybody involved in the conversations, or give them little chatter, banter, or just pass on information. UHF are great. At the same time, you can talk to other travelers depending on what channel you get onto, and I'll mention the channels in a minute, the useful ones. And also something I found very useful with UHF radios is when I'm on the blacktop, and if there happens to be a truck in front of me, which is quite often on our roads, rather than before I attempt an overtake, I speak to the truckie, and then they generally gives you a heads up of whether there's oncoming traffic or not, or if the way is clear. So I find that really useful with UHFs. At the same time, when you're out there in where there's no other cell phone signals or anything of that sort, and you want to just get help if you've got an emergency, you will be able to speak to someone on the UHF, but within limits. And I say that because UHFs have got limited range, and so it's within a certain proximity only that you can get signal. And if someone happens to be in that vicinity, then you can communicate with them, if you've got an emergency and if you need some help, whatever that emergency may be. So UHFs can be useful within a certain limit. Now there are different types of UHF radios you could have. You could have the fixed radio, which is permanently mounted in your vehicle. Alternatively, if you're just getting into this lifestyle, well, I'll say, if you want, go ahead and invest the money in it. They're not very expensive these days. Alternatively, if you just want to starting out, what you do is get yourself, a handheld radio, those little, what we call walkie-talkies. Now, one piece of advice is, from my experiences, if you buy a handheld, the strength of the signal is measured in watts, and you get 2-watt handhelds and 5-watt, and sometimes you get higher, but I would say spend the money and get a 5-watt. 2 watts are fine, but the range is so limited you won't get much out of it. So rather put a little bit extra and get yourself a 5-watt handheld, and get 2. Why I say get 2 is, one, obviously, is if you want to try and communicate with somebody else, another traveler, again if you have a situation, that helps within its limits. But at the same time, why I say get 2 is, if you're traveling with another friend who's in another vehicle, he may not have a UHF, just give him the second radio. Or if you got your partner or someone who's a passenger with you and he's going to help you through an obstacle, then you can talk to each other. He or she will be on the outside and you on the inside. You got the radio to talk to each other, so they're pretty useful. So yeah, UHF radios. Now, UHF radios, when you're out and about traveling, the useful codes to use is, and make a note of these. What I've done is I've made a note of these commonly used channels, and I've written it down and I kept it inside the glove box in my 4x4. And here are these are the commonly used ones. Channel 40, that's generally used by truck drivers. So like I said earlier, if I wanted to talk to a truckie, I go to channel 40. So channel 40 is for truckies. Channel 18 is generally used by those pulling caravans and campers. So that's a pretty good one to have a general chat. Four-wheel drivers, especially in national parks, to talk to each other, to give each other information, or to warn each other of your presence. Channel 10. So you can always use channel 10 in mainly in national parks, but even generally otherwise. And then channel 5 and channel 35 is generally reserved for severe emergencies. So try to avoid those unless you have to use it and if you're in that situation. So anything other than channel 40, 18, 10, 5 and 35, that's available for private use. So if you want to have a private chat with somebody else in your convoy, go ahead, pick something else. But don't pick the channels I just mentioned and then clog up the airwaves for a personal chat. One, others get to hear what your personal conversation is all about. Two, they don't really need to hear it. So keep those open. So I hope you found that useful. Make a note of it and put it in your glove box somewhere in the car. That's what I do. So another useful piece of communication equipment you can carry with you, now this depends on how remote you're going or how secure you want to feel, is a sat phone or satellite phone. It depends on the trip you're doing. You don't have to carry a satellite phone for every single trip that you do, but if you are planning to do remote traveling, which I wouldn't recommend if you're a beginner or you're getting into this lifestyle, don't do remote by yourselves unless you're traveling with a group of experienced travelers. But I'll mention it anyway. As a satellite phone is another piece of equipment that you can carry, and they're great because they'll work anywhere out there, and all it needs is a satellite signal, which is out in the open. You get it. And sat phones are not so expensive to rent. I generally pick up a rent from a local company for about $250, $220, approximately for about 7 to 8 days of traveling. And call rates are generally about $1 per minute outgoing. And text messages are, I think, about 50 cents. Stand to be corrected, but about 50 cents. For a certain number of text characters. Incoming is free. So if you want to save a bit of money, what you can do is, if you want someone to get hold of someone, send them a text message or ask them to call you back. That's one way to do it. But in case of an emergency, a sat phone would be brilliant because it's a direct connection through the satellite. My thinking, if you're doing several trips a year, and obviously you would be an experienced traveler by the time you're doing several remote trips a year. As a beginner you won't. It becomes more cost effective to buy yourself a sat phone rather than trying to rent it, because you're paying about $250 every time. So that's just a statement of the obvious. Another useful communication device to have is a PLB, a personal locator beacon. That's what it stands for, or an EPIRB. Basically what it is a little unit, and it gets direct connection to the satellite. In a situation of emergency, you just set it off and it sends via satellite, sends a signal to emergency services, and they will in turn respond immediately, and through the signal they know exactly what your location is. Now these are only to be used in dire straits situations, so it's not to be abused. Units are not very expensive, between $250 and $300 you can buy one of these. That's it, you once off, and then I think the battery lasts about 10 years. So it's only 10 years later you either replace the battery or just buy a new unit. And finally, as far as communications are concerned, there's a couple of useful apps that I have in my phone. And of course, these apps will only work if you've got cell phone coverage. But nevertheless, as long as you're in a coverage area, they're useful to have. And the three that I've got, I'm sure there are many others out there, but the three that I have, one is called Emergency Plus. That's quite useful in the situation of any emergency. I mean, this is not only when you're traveling off-road or going overlanding, even in your day-to-day traveling, it's great to have. And if you have an emergency or you see someone else in trouble, you can use that app within Australia to call emergency services. And the nice thing about it is if you call using that app, the app automatically sends the emergency services your exact location. Or if you just want to figure out what your location is, street name or GPS coordinates to the location where you are, the app will tell you, and you can relay that information to whoever you're speaking to, or they will automatically pick it up. So Emergency Plus, that's an app. Download it. It's a free app. It's great to have. Another good app, and I have it, is called First Aid. That too, you can use it for calling emergency services, and that too will give you exact locations to the authorities. At the same time, it's got useful first aid tips and so on you can use if need be in a free app. So download it. It's called First Aid. And then if you're traveling with pets, First Aid for Pets, that's a good app to have as well. It's got basic information again, and just how to diagnose certain symptoms, and what to do in the case of an emergency, if there is any, hopefully not. So those three apps are three apps that I use. Download them, play around with them, figure out how it works. When I say play around, don't ring emergency services, you get in big trouble, and then I'll get in trouble for that too because I just said so. But yeah, have them. Pretty useful as long as you got cell phone coverage. Okay, so now that I've touched on communications and different types of communication methods and devices, I'll get into other general safety, emergency related items that you should carry with you. Now, this is the thing. You'll be surprised how often I come across even seasoned travelers who don't pay attention to certain things like first aid, like fire extinguishers. You would think it's the obvious, but you'd be surprised. I've seen so many, and I have few friends who travel quite often, and the first aid kit and the fire extinguisher is at the bottom of their list when it should be right at the top. Sometimes I've seen some carrying first aid kits. The kit is there, but half the stuff is expired, or it hasn't been replenished since the last time they used it, which is probably when they needed it for something at home. So very important, because it's the moment when you need it, and hopefully you don't need it, but it's the moment you need it you realize, oh boy, I haven't got what I need in there, and you shouldn't run into that situation. So first aid kit, it's a no-brainer. It's stating the obvious, but have one. And in a first aid kit, have everything that usually comes with the first aid kit. I'm not going to list all of it, but generally, if wherever you're buying it from, they will give you a fully kitted first aid pack. But at the same time, figure out things that's required by you as an individual and your family. There are certain things that we need to carry if you've got a medical condition or not. So put them in the first aid kit as well. That becomes very useful. And something else I can highly recommend doing is, and it's not just if you're going off-road or camping, it's useful every single day of our lives, is go and do yourself a favor and enroll yourself into a first aid course. Usually there's like a 1-day course, or sometimes you get a 2-day course. You don't necessarily have to do the more advanced courses, but at least do the basic one, and you will be so grateful that you did it, because that knowledge is empowering. So do yourself a favor and get a first aid course done. At least one person in your family. Another no-brainer, but many a times I've seen overlooked, fire extinguishers. I would say at least carry 2 fire extinguishers in your vehicle. And along with your first aid kit, fire extinguishers, have them mounted or mounted in places that you as the driver can easily reach. Now in my case, the first aid kit is underneath the front passenger seat, so I can reach into it, or the passenger can easily reach and get the fire extinguisher out if need be. The second fire extinguisher in my case is at the back. I've got a wagon, so it's at the right at the back. So as I open the rear cargo door, there's a fire extinguisher there if I needed one. And my first aid kit is behind my seat, so as the driver I can reach in and get hold of the first aid kit if I needed to. So have them in easy reach within from yourself. At the same time, something I believe you should do is, in case of an emergency and you for some reason or the other cannot reach any of these, like the fire extinguisher or the first aid kit, somebody else should be able to figure out within quick time where these units are. So what I do is, wherever the fire extinguisher or the first aid kit is, I put a little sticker on the outside of the vehicle, usually on the window. You might have seen this in sometimes in emergency vehicles and so on. They have these stickers, so it's got a little sign of a fire extinguisher or a first aid kit or a little cross, and they're quite useful. And not many I've seen doing this, but it's only in that emergencies, and maybe you can't get to it, but somebody else can, and they'll, rather than trying to have to go through the whole vehicle to try and figure out where your fire extinguisher or your first aid kit is, that little sticker will go a long way in telling them exactly where they are. So something else I feel you should be doing is, before you set off on a trip, it could be a long trip or could be a short few day trip, but nevertheless, tell someone, tell friends, family of your route, where you're going, how many days you're going to be gone for, how many, at each location, how many days you're going to spend, and what your general plan is. So, it's that much better when you do that, because somebody is aware of your movements. So that's what I do. Again, I tell someone before we get set on of a trip of what my itinerary is. And so during an emergency, it's so much easier for someone to retrace your steps, so to speak. And it makes it so much more safer for you as a traveler. So tell someone about where you're going. In the glove compartment of my 4B, I've got a little notebook, and that's amongst other things, it's got telephone numbers of people that could be contacted in the case of an emergency. It's partly for me to remember, because we're so used to depending on devices these days. I tend to forget, and I think most of us have that problem these days. So it's there in the old-fashioned way. But at the same time, in the case of an emergency, and if somebody else, a third party, like an emergency services person or somebody else, needed to contact someone, a friend or a family member, then the numbers are there. It's easy, it's clear. And also, if you got any medical conditions or a specific type of medication that you're taking, write that down too. That information is so useful, and it's easy access. It's in your glove compartment. It's something I do, and I think it's pretty useful. Something else I do as well, and I've seen a number of other overlanders who I know do as well, and I think it's a brilliant idea, is to carry a grab bag. Because I've also seen many who just don't do it. And for many years I didn't do it either, because I never thought about it. But to have a grab bag. Now what I mean by a grab bag is if it is in a severe emergency situation, you have no choice but to abandon your vehicle and to get out, then those most important things that you need to carry. So obviously your wallet, your credit cards, any other documentation, identification documents, and that sort of thing, along with a bit of first aid stuff, not the entire first aid kit maybe, but a little first aid stuff, 1 or 2 bottles of water. You need to keep hydrated, especially if you're out in the outback, and things so on. I'll go into detail of that as a separate video, but a grab bag is something you need to think about. So what my wife and I do is, when we get into the vehicle to travel somewhere, or short distance or whatever, it doesn't matter, but as far as it's on a trip that we are on, things like our wallets, our cell phones, if they're not going in the cradle, credit cards, identification documents, and so on, go straight into that bag, and that bag sits at the back between the two front seats. So in an emergency, all I have to do is reach, grab it, and get out. Another useful safety item to have in your vehicle is one of these. This is a belt cutter, and a glass breaker on the top end. It's like a hammer. And hopefully you never need to use it, but if the need arose, then you got it. And it's not only for your 4x4 off-road vehicle, you can have it in your daily drive as well. Have it mounted in a place where it's easy access for yourself and the passenger. So in an emergency, you can just grab it real quick. And you get them all in different shapes and sizes, pretty much like a hammer though. This one is I found out only after I bought it. It's fancy, it's got a torch as well. And finally, something that's not commonly practiced this day and age, and I guess that's because we have so much of communication methods available to us this day and age. But something I still feel you should look at doing when you're going remote, especially if you're traveling alone, is registering your names at the local pub along the way or the local police station along the way. It's not mandatory, it's a voluntary thing, but it's a good practice, I feel, because that's another way, if anyone wanted to track you down or trace your steps or your movements, it's so much easier. So try and do that. I am not a big practicer of that myself, though I'm preaching it, but I think it is a good practice. So when you go remote, try and do that. If you stop at a pub, have a drink with somebody, just register at the pub. And if there's no pub, which is very unlikely, go to the local police station and just register there. So those are the tips I wanted to share with you. And now to the question of going remote. Well, if you're just getting into this lifestyle and if you're a beginner into this lifestyle, do not go remote by yourself. That is a big no-no. Unless, of course, you're traveling in a convoy where there's a whole heap of other experienced overlanders, off-roaders in that convoy, then yeah, of course, that's the best way to get experience. And in fact, that brings me to what I said in one of my previous videos, is the best way as a beginner is to join up with a local club. Join a 4x4 club, one that's nearest to you. There's so many available. And then travel with other experienced travelers. You will learn from them. And that way you'll eventually come to that point, you'll have the confidence to try travel remote, and possibly by yourself. I again don't always recommend going remote as a solo trip. I try not to do it. Certain trips within reason, if I am confident I can sustain myself, I'm fully self-sufficient, and in case of emergency I have ways of communicating, then I will attempt it. But generally I try to avoid. I try to at least have another vehicle going with me. So as a beginner, no, do not go alone out there. It's might seem simple, it might seem easy, but not the case. So I hope you found this video useful. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it. If you haven't subscribed already, please do subscribe. And for those of you who have already subscribed and who support me on this channel, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. If you missed the previous parts to this series on overlanding, off-roading for beginners, I'll leave the links above and in the description below. If you've got questions relating to this video or to the previous videos that I've done, please leave them in the comment section and I will answer them at the beginning of the next video. If you are an experienced traveler and you feel there are other things that you should add to this list I just talked about today in this video, please feel free to go and leave them in the comment section, because the more we share, the better it is for the wider community. So thank you for watching. I'll see you next Thursday when I talk about how I do my trip planning and the sort of the thinking process. Until next time, thank you for watching and I'll see you soon.